to The Straight Stitch, a podcast about sewing and other fiber arts. This is episode 72, and my name is Janet Szabo. I'll be your guide as we explore all things sewing. It's the second to the last week of March, but here in Kalispell in Montana, it's still snowing. The good thing is that at this time of year, the snow doesn't stick around, but it tends to be a bit demoralizing. The weather forecast for next week, though, is we might see a high of 60 degrees. So I'm excited about getting out to the greenhouse tomorrow to plant seedlings. In addition to what I start from my own garden, I am the chairman of a local fundraising plant sale, and we grow about half the inventory in my greenhouse. So the sale is in 2 months, and it's time to get things underway. I know for those of you in warmer areas, you might think that it's late for me to be starting seeds, but typically we don't put anything out into our gardens here until the last weekend in May. And even then, we've had snow on June 10th, so it's always a gamble. This is the time of year that my sewing comes to an abrupt halt, at least for a couple of months. It usually picks up again during the summer when I get the garden all straightened out and the animals all straightened out. I usually have some additional time for a few months to sew, and then it gets busy again in the fall, and then in the winter is when I do most of my sewing. I'm trying to finish up a few projects. I'm making some t-shirts for my friend Susan's grandsons, and I need to make a robe for my mother, and I have that project underway. It won't take long once I get it cut out, but it did take me a bit of time to prep the pattern. I've been teaching a fair bit. I went to Missoula last week to teach a ruler class, and then I went again this week to teach a Serger 101 class. That's a basic serger class, and students are allowed to bring any serger, whether it's brand spanking new or one that they've pulled out of the closet or gotten at a yard sale. And we go through the basics of using a serger, what the different stitches are, what the parts of the machine are, different threads, different needles. Believe it or not, I really enjoy that class because I never know what's going to show up. I have had everything from late 80s, early 90s vintage Burnett sergers all the way up to brand spanking new, fresh out of the box, fancy baby lock machines. So it's always a challenge, but it's one that I enjoy, and I leave those classes thinking sometimes that I've learned almost as much as the students have. Next week, I'll be teaching the third installment of my ruler class, my ruler quilting class, which we do here locally. This week, we're going to be working with some of the motif rulers like hexagons and stars and daisies and things like that. And then next weekend, I'm teaching the Bernina event here at our local quilt store, which is a 2-day event. We're making a table runner, and we're going to be sewing on both the sergers and the 790 and 990 machines. So that's exciting, and I know I'm going to learn a lot in that class too, because we're going to be doing some quilting with the machines using the embroidery module, and I haven't done that yet. I spent a bit of time this morning familiarizing myself with the class materials, and now I just need to get out my machine and practice a little bit. I was trying to decide what I wanted to cover in today's episode, and I've gotten quite a few emails, several, more than 2. Less than a dozen, more than 2 emails in the last week or so from people who either just started listening or who've maybe been listening for a while, but people who don't know a whole lot about me and have asked about my background and how I ended up in Montana and how I ended up doing what I'm doing. So I think that's what I'm going to cover today. Who am I and how did I get here? It's a story with quite a few plot twists, so I hope that you will find it interesting. I've alluded to bits and pieces of this journey in past podcast episodes, but I don't think I've ever told the whole story from start to finish. So that's what I'm going to try to do today. I grew up in a little town called Avon, Ohio, which is about, 15 or 20 miles west of Cleveland. When I go back there now to visit, it doesn't look anything like it did when I was growing up. When I was growing up, that town had a population of about 8,000. I think it's probably 4 times that size now, because back in the 60s and 70s and 80s, it was in a different county from Cleveland. And we used to joke that people from Cleveland would get to the county line and see a sign that said, "Here be dragons," and they wouldn't go any further. So even though we were fairly close geographically to Cleveland, it was still very much a rural area. There were a lot of places, a lot of small farms that actually grew grapes for Smucker's jelly. Most of them are now housing developments. My father was an engineer at NASA at Lewis Research Center in Brook Park, Ohio. My mother worked as the bookkeeper for her family's restaurant business. And I have a younger sister who's about 2 years younger than I am. When we were growing up, my mother stayed at home with us until we were in school, and she sewed virtually all of our clothes. She had a little sewing area in the laundry room, and I remember that in the evenings after dinner, she would go in there and work on projects. She made Raggedy Ann dolls for my sister and me, and I still have mine. And she made a lot of our clothes, and I can remember several beloved outfits that she made. Despite the fact that my mother was a very accomplished seamstress and also did other crafts like counted cross-stitch and knitting and crocheting, she wasn't real enthusiastic about us learning to do those things, so I didn't learn how to sew. I dabbled a little bit in embroidery. I think I was about 6 years old when I did an embroidered apple, and my mother actually saved it and framed it and sent it to me when I was an adult. So it's hanging upstairs in our hallway. And I do remember that about the time I was 8 or 9, I pestered my mother to teach me how to knit, which she did, and I rather took to knitting like a duck to water and kept doing it off and on. And then when I was in college, I knit constantly. I didn't knit in class because I was usually busy taking notes, but outside of class, I knit every spare minute that I had. I made sweaters for several of my friends, and I even, horror of horrors, made a sweater for my then boyfriend, who is now my husband. I had 2 knitting books. One was called Great Knitting in Vogue, which was a compilation of Vogue sweater patterns from the 30s through the 60s. And I had another book called All Sweaters in Every Gauge. And I used that second book to draft my own sweaters and the sweaters that I made for friends of mine. For you youngsters out there, this was pre-internet. We had no internet. I had 2 books, and I could call my mother for help when I needed it, but there was no YouTube. There was nothing. I had no way to look up things that I needed help with. If it wasn't something that I could find in those 2 books or get from my mother, I was out of luck. After college, I spent a semester in graduate school, and that's kind of a strange story and one of the plot twists in this whole journey. I was about 6 weeks from graduating from college, and I had been accepted to medical school at the University of Maryland, but I had also been awarded a National Science Foundation graduate fellowship for 3 years for a graduate school degree. And I remember standing in the living room at my boyfriend's house, the house that he and his roommates were renting, one afternoon looking at these 2 letters, trying to decide what I was going to do with the rest of my life. And I actually gave up my spot in medical school and decided to go to graduate school at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland, which is the medical school for the armed services. There was also a graduate school for civilians there, and I enrolled in the microbiology department to get a PhD. You might think that this was too good an opportunity to pass up. My boyfriend, then boyfriend, now husband, after graduation bought a house in southern York County, Pennsylvania, which was about an hour and a half drive from Washington, D.C., which is where I was in grad school. And every weekend I hit the Beltway at 4 o'clock on Friday, and I drove all the way up to Pennsylvania to see him for the weekend. And then on Sunday afternoon, I did it in reverse and came back to Bethesda. And long about December, my graduate advisor called me into her office and she said, "You do realize that after the first of the year, your little jaunts up to Pennsylvania are going to have to stop because we're going to expect you to be in the lab the entire time." And I said, "I need to think about this." Because, to be honest, I was a bit burned out. I didn't like what I was seeing in graduate school. One of the professors, and I was in a department that was at least 50% female, so it wasn't like I didn't have any role models, but there was one professor who was having a bit of a meltdown that semester that I was there because she had just turned 40 and decided to try and get pregnant and couldn't. And I remember one afternoon hearing her lament that she had put her life on hold to establish her career, and now she wanted to have kids and she couldn't do it. And I thought, I don't want that to be me in 20 years. My husband, then boyfriend, was living in a rural area of Pennsylvania, and that was what I wanted. I wanted a rural lifestyle. I did not want the big city. I did not want the rat race. So I gave back the National Science Foundation Graduate Fellowship, and I dropped out of grad school, and I went to Pennsylvania and married my boyfriend. I found a job in Baltimore, so I was still driving a fair bit because it was a 40-mile drive from our house in Pennsylvania down to Baltimore every day. But I found a job as a technical support specialist for a software developer. And this particular company had been under contract to the EPA in the 1970s and developed a suite of databases. And again, for you youngsters, this was pre-internet. We did have modems, we did have computers, and companies could purchase a subscription to this suite of databases and use their modems to dial into the databases and search for information and print out reports, and I was the technical support person. As part of that job, I got to travel around the country to all of the EPA offices where I did training classes on how to use this suite of databases, and I discovered that I really enjoyed teaching. I knew I liked traveling, but I also discovered that I really liked teaching. My husband was establishing himself as an independent contractor. He did renovations, he did small additions. We rehabbed the little farmhouse that we were living in, and I got pregnant and had our first daughter, and decided that I would stay home with her because working and trying to drive 40 miles to Baltimore every day and put a child in daycare was a bit too stressful. And we were talking about moving anyway because he had always wanted to live in Montana. So in 1993, when our daughter was a little less than a year old, we sold our house in Pennsylvania, packed everything we owned into a 24-foot cargo trailer, and he and I drove out to Montana, and my mother flew out a few days later with our daughter, and we rented a place for a few months until we looked around and found the property that we're on now and bought that. And then here came a fairly big plot twist. In June of 1994, so we hadn't even been in Montana for a year yet. In June of 1994, I was diagnosed with acute myelogenous leukemia. And because we were living in a fairly rural area without really good health services, the doctor who diagnosed me said, you need to be on the next plane out of here to either Houston or Seattle or someplace with a large teaching facility and a big hospital where you can be treated properly for this. So I literally got on a plane the next morning and flew back to Cleveland and went straight from the airport to the Cleveland Clinic. I spent the next 6 months in and out of the Cleveland Clinic. I had 3 rounds of chemotherapy, and in November, right before Thanksgiving, they sent me home and said, hopefully we won't see you again. If you can make it to 2 years without having a relapse, we will consider you cured. So I got back to Montana. My daughter was 2 years old, and I was trying to figure out how not to obsess about getting sick again. And when we first moved out to Montana, my husband had said to me, you're always knitting. Do you think that there's a way you could figure out how to make money from your knitting? And that was kind of the challenge that I needed. I had long thought about writing a book, and I really wanted to write a book about finishing techniques for knitters because I struggled trying to find that information. Again, remember, this is pre-internet, this is pre-YouTube. I struggled trying to find that information, and I thought, there are no books about this anywhere. There's lots of books about knitting techniques, and there's lots of books about patterns, but there aren't any books about how to sew a sweater together and how to plan for sewing a sweater together so that you have the best possible outcome. And I got kind of obsessed with this. So I started sending out book proposals. I sent one to Meg Swanson at Schoolhouse Press, and she sent me a lovely note in return. And she said, I like your idea, but my husband had just passed away, and I don't know what direction my business is going to go in, and I'm not taking any book proposals right now. I got a few more rejection slips, but I also got a letter from Taunton Press. And the woman at Taunton Press who had sent me the letter said that she was intrigued by the idea, but they were getting a new acquisitions editor, and she wanted the acquisitions editor to look over my proposal and make a decision about whether or not to follow through on it. A couple of weeks later, I got a rejection slip from that acquisitions editor, and I was so frustrated that I did what I probably wasn't supposed to do. I called her up and I said, look, please just tell me, am I a terrible writer? Was my proposal lousy? Why am I having such trouble finding a market for this book? And she said, it's a great idea. Your proposal was sound, but it's not a sexy topic. Nobody's going to want to buy a book about finishing techniques. And I thanked her and I hung up. And I walked out into the living room of the house that we were living in at the time, and I said to my husband, I am going to write this book if I have to do it myself. So I sat down at my computer, and again, this was in the days before Adobe InDesign or Adobe Photoshop or Adobe Illustrator. I can't even remember what the program was, Mac Word or something like that. And I had Mac Draw, and I drew the pictures on my computer using Mac Draw, and I wrote the book. And I had a friend with a desktop publishing system, which in those days could run you $10,000 or $15,000. And I took it to her, and she printed out a clean, nice copy for me. I went to a local lending institution, not a pawn shop, a lending institution, and I signed over the title to my Saturn station wagon, and they gave me $1,200, a $1,200 loan, which I spent on getting 500 copies of that book printed and comb bound at a local printer. I picked them up in July of 1996. I sent them out to as many yarn stores as I could find addresses for, and I hoped for the best. And amazingly, orders started coming in. So I paid back the original loan. I took out another loan. I got another printing done, and the rest is history. The I Hate to Finish Sweaters Guide to Finishing Sweaters was born, and I am still selling that book 30 years later. It's nothing fancy, but it is pretty comprehensive. By then, I decided that I wanted another child, and we weren't sure what was going to happen because the doctors at the Cleveland Clinic had told me that it was possible that I couldn't have any more kids after having chemo, that it would throw me into early menopause, but we were fortunate enough to get pregnant again, and I had my second daughter. She was born in 1997, and when she was about a year old, I left her with my husband and our older daughter, and I went to Billings, Montana to teach at the Montana Association of Weavers and Spinners conference there. And that was when I decided that I really wanted to concentrate on teaching. I was also working on my second book, which was Aran Sweater Design, because I really enjoyed designing cabled and Aran sweaters. And again, there wasn't a book out there about this. Alice Starmore had the most comprehensive information available, but I wanted to put my own spin on it. So I started working on that book, and I started applying to teach at Stitches and at TKGA, at the Knitting Guild of America events. I had also done the Master Knitting program from TKGA. So I felt like I had a good grasp of what I needed to know about knitting to be able to teach it effectively. Here's the funny thing. I was about 35 years old at the time when I was doing that, and I would walk into these classrooms at these conferences, and women would look at me, older women who are now my age, older women would look at me and they would say, "Oh, are you the teacher's assistant?" And I would say, "No, I'm the teacher." And I would get these looks, and a few of them even went so far as to say, "I don't think that you can teach me anything." In addition to teaching, in 2000, I decided to start Twists and Turns, the newsletter for lovers of cable knitting, because I wanted a way to produce my own designs, and I thought that that was an intriguing way to do it. It was a quarterly newsletter that featured at least one of my sweater designs, and usually something else like a hat or mittens or socks. Sometimes I published designs from other people. I produced that newsletter for 10 years, from 2000 until 2010. And by 2010, I was a bit burnt out. Traveling was hard on my husband because he has his own career, and I was leaving the kids with him. And while he's a great father and he loved being part of his kids' lives, logistically it just wasn't working for me to be gone so much. My older daughter was a senior in high school, and I knew that she was going to be leaving home pretty soon, and I didn't want to miss what was left of the time that we had together. So I decided to close down the newsletter and stop teaching, and I actually went back to school and learned to be a medical transcriptionist. That was a big switch, but I wanted something that I could do from home where I could be available to my kids, and I also wanted something that I found interesting to do, and I loved that job. I've always said if I could have a dream job that didn't have to do with the fiber arts, medical transcription would be it. But unfortunately, I did that for 10 years, and in 2020, I was replaced by a computer. Because most of the clinics and hospitals transitioned to electronic health records, and I have lots of thoughts about that, but suffice it to say, I no longer had a job as a medical transcriptionist. When I stopped doing knitting in 2010, because I belong to a Mennonite church here locally, the Mennonite church ladies who met to quilt once a month taught me how to quilt, because I knew I needed a break from knitting, but I didn't want to abandon the fiber arts altogether. And quilting was a way for me to do something new, but not get into garment sewing, which I didn't feel like I was prepared to do yet. I didn't know enough about sewing. I managed to graduate from high school without ever setting foot in the home ec room. So I had to learn all of that on my own, cooking and sewing and all of those domestic arts. So little by little, I taught myself what I needed to know about sewing and then quilting. And then I really wanted to start making clothing because I have a terrible time finding ready-to-wear that fits me. I'm taller than average. I have a long torso. Everything is too short on me. I bought a Juki serger. I started basic with it was about a $350 Juki serger, and started teaching myself what I needed to know about serging and making clothing. And after I lost my job as a medical transcriptionist, I went to the owner of the local quilt store and I said, "Do you have any classes that you'd like to teach for which you are looking for a teacher?" And she said, "Do you know how to use a serger?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, I do." So I began teaching the basic serger classes there, and then graduated to teaching some other classes. And now I teach serger classes and clothing classes and quilting classes. And that's how I ended up where I am today. I should note that I do have a couple of other jobs in addition to my teaching. We own a construction company with employees, and I am the bookkeeper for the construction company. We live on 7 acres, our original 5 acres with the house that we built, and the property next door with a rental house, which is a little over 2 acres. That parcel also has a beautiful south-facing open area that is my garden. We are committed to growing and eating as much food here as we can. So I raise a lot of crops over the summer and can them and freeze them for the winter. And we also raise pigs and chickens, and I'm responsible for watching the animals and taking care of them during the day, because summer is always my husband's busiest season, obviously. I'm always a little bit amused, I guess is the word, by the people who say to me, "I wish I had your life," because I will not sugarcoat it. It is a lot of work, what we do. My husband works from the minute he gets up in the morning until he goes to bed at night, and it's a joke in our neighborhood that he relaxes by working. And while he says it's not a competition, I have a little bit of a competitive streak in me, and I like to stay busy as well, so we're both working pretty much every minute that we're awake. I've kept a blog for a long time. It's probably going on 15 or 16 years now. I started it to keep my mother and my mother-in-law informed about what was going on here in Montana. And then lo and behold, a whole bunch of other people started reading it. I talk about sewing there. That's where you can see pictures of my sewing projects. I also talk about life here in Montana. This week I'm trying to get chicks, and trying to get chicks from the farm store has been an exercise in frustration. And then about 18 months ago, on the day that my husband and I loaded up 8 pigs to take them to the processor, only to discover that the processor wasn't there that day and hadn't told us, I was driving into town and listening to a podcast about homesteading, and a little voice inside my head said, "You need to start a podcast about sewing." So I did, and here we are. Is this the life I envisioned when I was in college? Heck no. Do I love it? Absolutely. I wouldn't want to be doing anything else. So if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. You can use the fan mail feature if you download or listen to the podcast on Apple Podcasts. You can also email me at janet@janetzabo.com or through the show notes page on the podcast website, and that is at www.thestraightstitchpodcast.com. My website is at www.janetzabo.com, and that's Zabo as S as in Sam, Z as in zebra, A, B as in boy, O. Ask me how many times a week I spell that. There are links on my website to get to my Big Sky Knitting Designs website and also to my blog. I really appreciate those of you who have left ratings and reviews at Apple Podcasts. That does go a long way to helping other people find the podcast. The audience is growing, and I love that. So if you have show suggestions, please let me know. I've gotten some great suggestions for guests for future interviews, and I am contacting those people and trying to get them scheduled. So keep the ideas coming. I want to bring you the kind of content that you're interested in. So until next time, I hope that you have a great week and that you get to go sew something.